Part 4 of Chapter 9 of The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, translated by William Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. Chapter 9. The Doctrine of Notion. C. The Idea. The idea is truth in itself and for itself, the absolute unity of the notion and objectivity. Its ideal content is nothing but the notion in its detailed terms. Its real content is only the exhibition which the notion gives itself in the form of external existence, whilst yet, by enclosing the shape in its ideality, it keeps it in its power, and so keeps itself in it. The definition which declares the absolute to be the idea is itself absolute. All former definitions come back to this. The idea is the truth, for truth is the correspondence of objectivity with the notion, not of course the correspondence of external things with my conceptions, for these are only correct conceptions held by me, the individual person. In the idea we have nothing to do with the individual, nor with the figurate conceptions, nor with external things. And yet again, everything actual in so far as it is true is the idea, and has its truth by and in virtue of the idea alone. Every individual being is some one aspect of the idea, for which therefore yet other actualities are needed, which in their turn appear to have a self-subsistence of their own. It is only in them altogether, and in their relation, that the notion is realized. The individual by itself does not correspond to its notion. It is this limitation of its existence which constitutes the finitude and the ruin of the individual. The idea itself is not to be taken as an idea of something or other, any more than the notion is to be taken as merely a specific notion. The absolute is the universal in one idea, which by an act of judgment particularizes itself to the system of specific ideas, which after all are constrained by their nature to come back to the one idea where their truth lies. As issued out of this judgment, the idea is in the first place only the one universal substance, but its developed and genuine actuality is to be a subject, and in that way as mind. Because it has no existence for a starting point and point d'appui, the idea is frequently treated as a mere logical form. Such a view must be abandoned to those theories which ascribe so-called reality and genuine actuality to the existent thing, and all other categories which have not yet penetrated as far as the idea. It is no less false to imagine the idea to be mere abstraction. It is abstract certainly, in so far as everything untrue is consumed in it, but in its own self it is essentially concrete, because it is the free notion giving character to itself, and that character, reality. It would be an abstract form only if the notion, which is its principle, were taken to be an abstract unity, and not the negative return of it into self as the subjectivity which it really is. Truth is at first taken to mean that I know how something is. This is truth, however, only in reference to consciousness. It is a formal truth, bare correctness. Truth in the deeper sense consists in the identity between objectivity and the notion. It is in this deeper sense of truth that we speak of a true state, or of a true work of art. These objects are true if they are as they ought to be, i.e. if their reality corresponds to their notion. When thus viewed, to be untrue means much the same as to be bad. A bad man is an untrue man, a man who does not behave as his notion or his vocation requires. Nothing, however, can subsist, if it be wholly devoid of identity between the notion and reality. Even bad and untrue things have being, in so far as their reality still somehow conforms to their notion. Whatever is thoroughly bad or contrary to the notion is for that very reason on the way to ruin. It is by the notion alone that the things in the world have their subsistence, or, as it is expressed in the language of religious conception, things are what they are only in virtue of the divine, and thereby creative thought which dwells within them. When we hear the idea spoken of, we need not imagine something far away beyond this mortal sphere. The idea is rather what is completely present, and it is found, however confused and degenerated, in every consciousness. We conceive the world to ourselves as a great totality which is created by God, and so created that in it God has manifested himself to us. We regard the world also as ruled by divine providence, implying that the scattered and divided parts of the world are continually brought back and made conformable to the unity from which they have issued. The purpose of philosophy has always been the intellectual ascertainment of the idea. Everything deserving the name of philosophy has constantly been based on the consciousness of an absolute unity where the understanding sees and accepts only separation. It is too late now to ask for proof that the idea is the truth. The proof of that is contained in the whole deduction and development of thought up to this point. The idea is the result of this course of dialectic. not that it is to be supposed that the idea is mediate only, i.e. mediated through something else than itself. It is rather its own result, and being so is no less immediate than mediate. The stages hitherto considered, viz. those of being and essence, as well as those of notion and objectivity, are not, when so distinguished, something permanent, resting upon themselves. They have proved to be dialectical, and their only truth is that they are dynamic elements of the idea. The idea may be described in many ways. It may be called reason, and this is the proper philosophical signification of reason, subject-object, the unity of the ideal and the real, of the finite and infinite, of soul and body. The possibility which has its actuality in its own self, that of which the nature can be thought only as existent, etc. All these descriptions apply because the idea contains all the relations of understanding, but contains them in their infinite self-return and self-identity. It is easy work for the understanding to show that everything said of the idea is self-contradictory, but that can quite as well be retaliated, or rather in the idea the retaliation is actually made. And this work, which is the work of reason, is certainly not easy as that of understanding. Understanding may demonstrate that the idea is self-contradictory, because the subjective is subjective only and is always confronted by the objective. Because being is different from notion, therefore cannot be picked out of it, because the finite is finite only and the exact antithesis of the infinite, and therefore not identical with it, and so on with every term of the description. The reverse of all this, however, is the doctrine of logic. Logic shows that the subjective, which is to be subjective only, the finite, which would be finite only, the infinite, which would be infinite only, and so on, have no truth, but contradict themselves and pass over into their opposites. Hence this transition and the unity in which the extremes are merged and become factors, each with a merely reflected existence, reveals itself as their truth. The understanding, which addresses itself to deal with the idea, commits a double misunderstanding. It takes first the extremes of the idea, be they expressed as they will, as long as they are in their unity, not as they are understood when stamped with this concrete unity, but as if they remained abstractions outside of it. It no less mistakes the relation between them ever when it has been expressly stated. Thus, for example, it overlooks even the nature of the copula in the judgment, which affirms that the individual or subject is after all not individual but universal. But in the second place, the understanding believes its reflection, that the self-identical idea contains its own negative, or contains contradiction, to be an external reflection which does not lie within the idea itself. But the reflection really is no peculiar cleverness of understanding. The idea itself is the dialectic which forever divides and distinguishes the self-identical from the differentiated, the subjective from the objective, the finite from the infinite, soul from body. Only on these terms is it an eternal creation, eternal vitality, and eternal spirit. But while it thus passes, or rather translates itself into the abstract understanding, it forever remains reason. The idea is the dialectic, which again makes this mass of understanding and diversity understand its finite nature, and the pseudo-independence in its production, which brings the diversity back to unity. Since this double movement is not separate or distinct in time, nor indeed in any other way, otherwise it would only be a repetition of the abstract understanding. The idea is the eternal vision of itself in the other, notion which in its objectivity has carried out itself, object which is inward design, essential subjectivity. The different modes of apprehending the idea as unity of ideal and real, of finite and infinite, of identity and difference, etc., are more or less formal. They designate some one stage of the specific notion. Only the notion itself, however, is free and the genuine universal. In the idea, therefore, the specific character of the notion is only the notion itself, an objectivity viz. Into which, being the universal, continues itself, and in which it has only its own character, the total character. The idea is the infinite judgment, of which the terms are severally the independent totality, and in which, as each grows to the fullness of its own nature, it has thereby at the same time passed into the other. None of the other specific notions exhibit this totality, complete on both its sides, as the notion itself and objectivity. The idea is essentially a process, because its identity is the absolute and free identity of the notion, only insofar as it is absolute negativity, for that reason dialectical. It is the round of movement in which the notion, in the capacity of universality which is individuality, gives itself the character of objectivity, and of the antithesis thereto. And this externality which has the notion for its substance finds its way back to subjectivity through its immediate dialectic. As the idea is a process, it follows that such an expression for the absolute as unity of thought and being of finite and infinite, etc. is false. For unity expresses an abstract and merely quiescent identity. As the idea is B, subjectivity, it follows that expression is equally false on another account, that unity of which it speaks expressly a merely virtual or underlying presence of the genuine unity. The infinite would thus seem to be merely neutralized by the finite, the subjective by the objective, thought by being. But in the negative unity of the idea, the infinite overlaps, includes the finite, thought overlaps being, subjectivity overlaps objectivity. The unity of the idea is thought, infinity, and subjectivity, and is in consequence to be essentially distinguished from the idea as substance, just as this overlapping subjectivity, thought, or infinity is to be distinguished from the one-sided subjectivity, one-sided thought, one-sided infinity to which it descends in judging and defining. The idea as process runs through three stages in development. The first form of the idea is life, that is, the idea in the form of immediacy. The second form is that of mediation or differentiation, and this is the idea in the form of knowledge, which appears under the double aspect of the theoretical and practical idea. The process of knowledge eventuates in the restoration of the unity enriched by difference. This gives the third form of the idea, the absolute idea, which last stages of logical idea evinces itself to be at the same time the true first, and to have being due to itself alone. The immediate idea is life. As soul, the notion is realized in a body, of whose externality the soul is the immediate self-relating universality. But the soul is also the particularization, so that the body expresses no other distinctions than follow from the characterizations of its notion. And finally, it is the individuality of the body as infinite negativity, the dialectic of that bodily objectivity, with its parts lying out of one another, conveying them away from the semblance of independent subsistence back into subjectivity, so that all members are reciprocally momentary means as well as momentary ends. Thus, as life is the initial particularization, so it results in the negative self-asserting unity. In the dialectic of its corporality, it only coalesces with itself. In this way, life is essentially something alive, and in point of its immediacy, this individual living thing. It is characteristic of finitude in the sphere that, by reason of the immediacy of the idea, body and soul are separable. This constitutes the mortality of the living being. It is only, however, when the living being is dead, that these two sides of the idea are different ingredients. The single members of the body are what they are only by and in relation to their unity. A hand, for example, when hewn off from the body, is, as Aristotle has observed, a hand in name only, not in fact. From the point of view of understanding, life is usually spoken of as a mystery, and in general as incomprehensible. But giving it such a name, however, the understanding only confesses it, only finitude and nullity. So far is life from being incomprehensible, that in it the very notion is presented to us, or rather the immediate idea existing as notion. And having said that, we have vindicated the defect of life. Its notion and reality do not thoroughly correspond to each other. The notion of life is the soul, and this notion has the body for its reality. The soul is, as it were, infused into its corporeity, and in that way it is at first sentient only, and not yet freely self-conscious. The process of life consists in getting the better of the immediacy with which it is still beset, and this process, which is itself threefold, results in the idea under the form of judgment, i.e. the idea as cognition. A living being is a syllogism, of which the very elements are in themselves systems and syllogisms. They are, however, active syllogisms of processes, and in the subjective unity of the vital agent make only one process. Thus the living being is the process of its coalescence with itself, which runs on through three processes. 1. The first process of the living being inside itself. In that process it makes a split on its own self and reduces its corporeity to its object, or its inorganic nature. This corporeity, as an aggregate of correlations, enter in its very nature into difference and opposition of its elements, which mutually become each other's prey, and assimilate one another, and are retained by producing themselves. Yet this action of several members, organs, is only the living subject's one act, to which their productions revert. So that in these productions nothing is produced except the subject. In other words, the subject only reproduces itself. The process of the vital subject within its own limits has in nature the threefold form of sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. As sensibility, the living being is immediately simple self-relation. It is the soul omnipresent in its body, the outsideness of each member of which to others has for it no truth. As irritability, the living being appears split up in itself. And as reproduction, it is perpetually restoring itself from the inner distinction of its members and organs. Vital agent only exists as this continually self-renewing process within its own limits. But the judgment of the notion proceeds as free to discharge the objective or bodily nature as independent totality from itself, and the negative relation of the living thing to itself makes its immediate individuality the presupposition of an inorganic nature confronting it. As this negative of animate is no less a function in the notion of the animate itself, it exists consequently in the latter, which is at the same time a concrete universal, in the shape of a defect or a want. The dialectic by which the object, being implicitly null, is merged, is the action of self-assured living thing, which in this process against an inorganic nature thus retains, develops, and objectifies itself. The living being stands face to face with an inorganic nature, comports itself as a master which it assimilates to itself. The result of the assimilation is not, as in the chemical process, a neutral product in which the independence of the two confronting sides is merged, but the living being shows itself as large enough to embrace its other, which cannot withstand its power. The inorganic nature which is subdued by the vital agent suffers this fate, because it is virtually the same as what life is actually. Thus in the other living being only coalesces with itself, but when the soul has fled from the body, the elementary powers of objectivity begin their play. These powers are, as it were, continually on the spring, ready to begin their process in the organic body, and life is the constant battle against them. The living individual, which in its first process comports itself as intrinsically subject and notion, through its second assimilates its external objectivity, and thus puts the character of reality into itself. It is now therefore implicitly a kind, with essential universality of nature. The particularizing of this kind is the relation of living subject to another subject of its kind, and the judgment is the tie of kind over these individuals, thus appointed for each other. This is the affinity of the sexes. The process of kind brings it to a being of its own, life being no more than the idea immediate. The product of this process breaks up into two sides. On the one hand, the living individual, which was at first presupposed as immediate, is now seen to be mediated and generated. On the other hand, the living individuality, which on account of its first immediacy stands in a negative attitude towards universality, sinks in the superior power of the latter. The living being dies because it is a contradiction. Implicitly it is the universal or kind, and yet immediately it exists as an individual only. Death shows the kind to be the power that rules the immediate individual. For the animal, the process of the kind is the highest point of its vitality, but the animal never gets so far in its kind as to have a being of its own. It succumbs to the power of kind. In the process of kind, the immediate living being mediates itself with itself, and thus rises above its immediacy, only however to sink back into it again. Life thus runs away, in the first instance, only into the false infinity of the progress ad infinitum. The real result, however, of the process of life, in the point of its notion, is to merge and overcome that immediacy with which the idea in the shape of life is still beset. In this manner, however, the idea of life has thrown off not some one particular and immediate this, but this first immediacy as whole. It thus comes to itself, to its truth. It enters upon existence as a free kind, self-subsistence. The death of merely immediate and individual vitality is the procession of spirit. Cognition in general. The idea exists free for itself insofar as it has universality for the medium of its existence, as objectivity itself has notional being, as the idea is its own object. Its subjectivity, thus universalized, is pure self-contained distinguishing of the idea, intuition which keeps itself in this identical universality, but as specific distinguishing, it is the further judgment of repelling itself as a totality from itself, and thus in the first place presupposing itself as an external universe. These two judgments, which though implicitly identical, are not yet explicitly put as identical. The relation of these two ideas, which implicitly and as life are identical, is this one of correlation, and it is that correlativity which constitutes the characteristic of finitude in this sphere. The relationship of reflection, seeing that the distinguishing of the idea is in its own self, is only the first judgment, presupposing the other and not yet supposing itself to constitute it. And thus for the subjective idea, the objective is the immediate world found ready to hand, or the idea as life in the phenomenon of individual existence. At the same time, insofar as this judgment is pure distinguishing within its own limits, the idea realizes in one both itself and its other. Consequently, it is the certitude of the virtual identity between itself and the objective world. Reason comes to the world with an absolute faith in its ability to make the identity actual, and to raise its certitude to truth, and with instinct of realizing explicitly the nullity of that contrast which it sees to be implicitly null. This process is in general terms cognition. In cognition, in a single act, the contrast is virtually superseded as regards both the one-sidedness of subjectivity and the one-sidedness of objectivity. At first, however, the supersession of the contrast is but implicit. The process as such is in consequence immediately infected with the finitude of the sphere, and splits into the twofold movement of the instinct of reason, presented as two different movements. On the one hand, it supersedes the one-sidedness of the idea's subjectivity by receiving the existing world into itself, into subjective conception and thought, and with this objectivity, which is thus taken to be real and true, for its content, it fills up the abstract certitude of itself. On the other hand, it supersedes the one-sidedness of the objective world, which is now, on the contrary, estimated as only a mere semblance, a collection of contingencies and shapes at bottom visionary. It modifies and informs that world by the inward nature of the subjective, which is here taken to be the genuine object. The former is the instinct of science after truth, cognition properly so called, the theoretical action of the idea. The latter is the instinct of good to fulfil the same practical activity as the idea or volition. Cognition proper. The universal finitude of cognition, which lies in the one judgment, the presupposition of the contrast, a presupposition in contradiction of which its own act lodges protest, specialises itself more precisely on the face of its own idea. The result of that specialisation is that its two elements receive the aspect of being diverse from each other, and, as they are at least complete, they take up the relation of reflection, not of notion, to one another. The assimilation of the matter, therefore, as a datum, presents itself in the light of reception of it into categories, which at the same time remain external to it, which meet each other in the same style of diversity. Reason is active here, but it is reason in the shape of understanding. The truth which such cognition can reach will therefore be only finite. The infinite truth of the notion is isolated and made transcendent, an inaccessible goal in a world of its own. Still, in its external action, cognition stands under the guidance of the notion. The notional principles form the secret clue to its movement. The finitude of cognition lies in the presupposition of a world already in existence, and in the consequent view of the knowing subject as tabula rasa. The conception is one attributed to Aristotle, but no man is further than Aristotle from such an outside theory of cognition. Such a style of cognition does not recognise in itself the activity of the notion, an activity which it is implicitly, but not consciously. In its own estimation, its procedure is passive. Really, that procedure is active. Finite cognition, when it presupposes what is distinguished from it to be something already existing and confronting it to be various facts of external nature and consciousness, has, in the first place, 1. Formal identity, or the abstraction of universality for the form of its action. Its activity therefore consists in analysing the given concrete object, isolating its differences and giving them the form of abstract universality. Or it leaves the concrete thing as a ground, and by setting aside the unessential looking particulars, brings into relief a concrete universal, the genus or force and law. This is the analytic method. People generally speak of the analytical and synthetical methods as if it depended solely on our choice which we pursued. This is far from the case. It depends on the form of the objects of our investigation, which of the two methods that are derivable from the notion of finite cognition ought to be applied. In the first place, cognition is analytical. Analytical cognition deals with an object which is presented in detachment, and the aim of its action is to trace back to a universal the individual object before it. Thought in such circumstances means no more than an act of abstraction or of formal identity. That is the sense in which thought is understood by Locke and all empiricists. Cognition, it is often said, can never do more than separate the given concrete object into their abstract elements, and then consider these elements in their isolation. It is, however, at once apparent that this turns things upside down, and that cognition, if its purpose be to take things as they are, thereby falls into contradiction with itself. Thus the chemist, for example, places a piece of flesh in his retort, tortures it in many ways, and then informs us that it consists of nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, etc. True, but these abstract matters have ceased to be flesh. The same defect occurs in the reasoning of an empirical psychologist when he analyses an action in the various aspects which presents and then sticks to these aspects in their separation. The object which is subject to analysis is treated as a sort of onion from which one coat is peeled off after another. This universality is, too, also a specific universality. In this case, the line of activity follows the three moments of the notion, which, as it has not its infinity in finite cognition, is the specific or definite notion of understanding. The reception of the object into the forms of this notion is the synthetic method. The movement of synthetic method is the reverse of the analytical method. The latter starts from the individual and proceeds to the universal. In the former, the starting point is given by the universal as a definition, from which we proceed by particularizing in division to the individual, the theorem. The synthetic method thus presents itself as the development, the moments of the notion of the object. When the object has been, in the first instance, brought by cognition into the form of specific notion in general, so that in this way its genus and its universal character or speciality are explicitly stated, we have definition. The materials and proof of definition are procured by means of the analytical method. The specific character, however, is expected to be a mark only. That is to say, it is to be in behoof only of the purely subjective cognition which is external to the object. Definition involves the three organic elements of the notion: the universal or proximate genus, genus proximum, the particular specific character of the genus, qualitas specifica, and the individual or object defined. The first question that definition suggests is where it comes from. The general answer to this question is to say that definitions originate by way of analysis. This will explain how it happens that people quarrel about the correctness of proposed definitions, for here everything depends on what perception we started from, and what points of view we had before our eyes. The richer the object to be defined is, that is, the more numerous are the aspects of which it offers to our notice, the more various are the definitions we may frame of it. Thus there are quite a host of definitions of life, of the state, etc. Geometry, on the contrary, dealing with a theme so abstract as space, has an easy task in giving definitions. Again, in respect to the matter or contents of the objects defined, there is no constraining necessity present. We are expected to admit that space exists, that there are plants, animals, etc., nor is it the business of geometry, botany, etc. to demonstrate that the objects in question necessarily are. The very circumstance makes the synthetical method of cognition as little suitable for philosophy as the analytical. For philosophy has above all things to leave no doubt of the necessity of its objects, and yet several attempts have been made to introduce the synthetical method into philosophy. Thus Spinoza in particular begins with definition. He says, for instance, that substance is causa sui. His definitions are unquestionably a storehouse of the most speculative truth, but it takes the shape of dogmatic assertion. The same thing is also true of Schelling. The statement of the second element of the notion, i.e. of the specific character of the universal as particularizing, is given by division in accordance with some external consideration. Division, we are told, ought to be complete. That requires a principle or ground of division so constituted that the division based upon it embraces the whole extent of the region designated by the definition in general. But in division there is further requirement that the principle of it must be borrowed from the nature of the object in question. If this condition be satisfied, the division is natural and not merely artificial, that is to say, arbitrary. Thus in zoology, the ground of division adopted in the classification of the mammalia is mainly afforded by their teeth and claws. That is so far sensible, as the mammals themselves distinguish themselves from one another by these parts of their bodies, back to which therefore the general type of their various classes is to be traced. In every case the genuine division must be controlled by the notion. To that extent a division in the first instance has three members, but as particularity it exhibits itself as double. The division may go to the extent even of four members. In the sphere of mind, trichotomy is predominant, a circumstance which Kant has the credit of bringing into notice. In the concrete individuality, where the mere unanalyzed quality of the definition is regarded as correlation of elements, the object is a synthetical nexus of distinct characteristics. It is a theorem. Being different, these characteristics possess but a mediated identity. To supply the materials which form the middle terms is the office of construction. The process of mediation itself, from which cognition derives the necessity of that nexus, is the demonstration. As the difference between the analytical and synthetical methods is commonly stated, it seems entirely optional which of the two we employ. If we assume to start with the concrete thing which the synthetical method presents as a result, we can analyse from it as consequence the abstract propositions which formed the presuppositions and the material for the proof. Thus algebraic definitions of curved lines are theorems in the method of geometry. Similarly, even the Pythagorean theorem, if made the definition of a right-angled triangle, might yield to analysis those propositions which geometry had already demonstrated on its behoof. The optionalness of either method is due to both alike starting from an external presupposition. So far as nature of the notion is concerned, analysis is prior, since it has to raise the given material with its empirical concreteness into the form of general abstractions, which may then be set in front of the synthetic method as definitions. That these methods, however indispensable and brilliantly successful in their own province, are unserviceable for philosophical cognition is self-evident. They have presuppositions, and their style of cognition is that of understanding, proceeding under the canon of formal identity. In Spinoza, who was especially addicted to the use of geometrical method, we are at once struck by its characteristic formalism. Yet his ideas were speculative in spirit, whereas the system of Wolff, who carried the method out to the height of the pedantry, was even in subject matter a metaphysic of understanding. The abuses which these methods with their formalism once led to in philosophy and science have in modern times been followed by the abuses of what is called construction. Kant brought into vogue the phrase that mathematics construes its notions. All that was meant by the phrase was that mathematics has not to do with notions, but with abstract qualities of sense perception. The name construction, constructing, of notions has since been given to a sketch or statement of sensible attributes which were picked up from perception, quite guiltless of any influence of the notion, and to additional formalism of classifying scientific and philosophical objects in a tabular form on some presupposed rubric, but in other respects at the fancy and discretion of the observer. In the background of all this, certainly there is a dim consciousness of the idea, of the unity of the notion and objectivity, a consciousness too that the idea is concrete. But that play of what is styled construing is far from presenting this unity adequately, a unity which is none other than the notion properly so called, and the sensuous concreteness of perception is as little the concreteness of reason and the idea. Another point calls for notice. Geometry works with the sensuous but abstract perception of space, and in space it experiences no difficulty in isolating and defining certain simple analytical modes. To geometry alone therefore belongs in its perfection the synthetical method of finite cognition. In its course, however, and this is the remarkable point, it finally stumbles upon what are termed irrational and incommensurable qualities, and in their case any attempt at further specification drives it beyond the principle of the understanding. This is only one of many instances in terminology where the title rational is perversely applied to the province of understanding, while we stigmatize as irrational that which shows a beginning and a trace of rationality. Other sciences, removed as they are from simplicity of space or number, often and necessarily reach a point where understanding permits no further advance, but they go over the difficulty without trouble. They make a break in the strict sequence of their procedure, and assume whatever they require, though it be the reverse of what proceeded from some external quarter, opinion, perception, conception, or any other source. Its inobservancy as to the nature of its method and their relativity to the subject matter prevents the finite cognition from seeing that when it proceeds by definitions and divisions, etc., it is really led on by the necessity of the laws of notion. For the same reason it cannot see when it has reached its limit, nor, if it has transgressed that limit, does it perceive that it is in a sphere where the categories of understanding, which it still continues rudely to apply, have lost all authority. The necessity which finite cognition produces in the demonstration is in the first place an external necessity, intended for the subjective intelligence alone, but in necessity as such, cognition itself has left behind its presupposition and starting point, which consisted in the accepting its content as given or found. Necessity qua necessity is implicitly the self-relating notion. The subjective idea has thus implicitly reached an original and objective determinateness, a something not given for that reason immanent in the subject. It is passed over into the idea of will. The necessity which cognition reaches by means of demonstration is the reverse of what formed its starting point. In its starting point, cognition has a given and contingent content, but now, at the close of its movement, it knows its content to be necessary. This necessity is reached by means of the subjective agency. Similarly, subjectivity at starting was quite abstract, a bare tabula rasa, and now shows itself as a modifying and determining principle. In this way we pass from the idea of cognition to that of will. The passage will be apparent on a closer examination, means that the universal, to be truly apprehended, must be apprehended as subjectivity, as notion self-moving, active and form-imposing. The subjective idea as an original and objective determinateness, and as the simple uniform content, is the good. Its impulse towards self-realization is in its behaviour the reverse of the idea of truth, and rather directed towards moulding the world it finds before it into a shape conformable to its purpose end. This volition has, on the other hand, the certitude of the nothingness of the presupposed object, but on the other, as finite, it at the same time presupposes the purpose end of the good to be a mere subjective idea, and the object to be independent. This action of the will is finite, and its finitude lies in the contradiction that in the inconsistent terms applied to the objective world, the end of the good is just as much not executed as executed, the end in question put as unessential as much as essential. The actual and at the same time is merely possible. This contradiction presents itself to imagination as an endless progress in the actualizing of the good, which is therefore set up and fixed as a mere ought or goal of perfection. In point of form, however, this contradiction vanishes when the action supersedes the subjectivity of the purpose, and along with it the objectivity, with the contrast which makes both finite, abolishing subjectivity as a whole and not merely the one-sidedness of this form of it. For another new subjectivity of the kind, that is, a new generation of the contrast, is not distinct from that which is supposed to be past and gone. This return into itself is at the same time the content's own recollection, that is the good and the implicit identity of the two sides. It is a recollection of the presupposition of the theoretical attitudes of mind, that the objective world is its own truth and substantiality. While intelligence merely proposes to take the world as it is, will takes steps to make the world what it ought to be. Will looks upon the immediate and given present not as solid being, but as mere semblance without reality. It is here that we meet those contradictions which are so bewildering from the standpoint of abstract morality. This position in its practical bearings is the one taken by the philosophy of Kant and even by that of Fichte. The good, say these writers, has to be realized. We have to work in order to produce it, and will is only the God actualizing itself. If the world then were as it ought to be, the action of will would be at an end. The will itself therefore requires that its end should not be realized. In these words, a correct expression is given to the finitude of will. But finitude was not meant to be the ultimate point, and it is the process of will itself which abolishes finitude and the contradiction it involves. The reconciliation is achieved when will in its results returns to the presupposition made by cognition. In other words, it consists in the unity of the theoretical and practical idea. Will knows the end to be its own, and intelligence apprehends the world as the notion actual. This is the right attitude of rational cognition. Nullity and transitoriness constitute only the superficial features and not real essence of the world. That essence is the notion in posse and in esse, and thus the world is itself the idea. All unsatisfied endeavour ceases when we recognise that the final purpose of the world is accomplished no less than ever accomplishing itself. Generally speaking, this is the man's way of looking. While the young imagine the world utterly sunk in wickedness, and that the first thing needful is a thorough transformation. The religious mind, on the contrary, views the world as ruled by divine providence, therefore correspondent with what it ought to be. But this harmony between the is and the ought to be is not torpid and rigid stationary. Good, the final end of the world, has being only while it constantly produces itself. And the world of spirit and the world of nature continue to have this distinction, that the latter moves only in a recurring cycle, while the former certainly also makes progress. Thus the truth of the good is laid down as the unity of the theoretical and practical idea in the doctrine that the good is radically and really achieved, and the objective world is in itself and for itself the idea, just as it at the same time eternally lays itself down as end, and by action brings about its actuality. This life which has returned to itself from the bias and finitude of cognition, and which by the activity of the notion has become identical with it, is the speculative or absolute idea. The absolute idea. The idea as unity of the subjective and objective idea is the notion of the idea, a notion whose object, Gegenstand, is the idea as such, and for which the objective, Objekt, is idea. An object which embraces all characteristics in its unity. This unity is consequently the absolute and all truth, the idea which thinks itself, and here at least as a thinking or logical idea. The absolute idea is, in the first place, the unity of the theoretical and practical idea, and thus at the same time the unity of the idea of life with the idea of cognition. In cognition we have the idea in a biased, one-sided shape. The process of cognition has issued into the overthrow of this bias, and the restoration of that unity, which is as unity and in its immediacy is in the first instance the idea of life. The defect of life lies in its being only the idea implicit or natural, whereas cognition is in an equally one-sided way the merely conscious idea or the idea for itself. The unity and truth of these two is the absolute idea, which is both in itself and for itself. Hitherto we have had the idea in the development through its various grades as our object, but now the idea comes to be its own object. This means the Greek, which Aristotle long ago termed the supreme form of the idea. Seeing that there is in it no transition or presupposition, and in general no specific character other than what is fluid and transparent, the absolute idea is for itself the pure form of the notion, which contemplates its content as its own self. It is its own content, and in so far as it ideally distinguishes itself from itself, and the one of the two things distinguished is a self-identity in which, however, is contained the totality of form as the system of terms describing its content. This content is the system of logic, and that is at this stage left as a form of the idea. All that is at this stage left as form for the idea is the method of this content, the specific consciousness of the value and currency of the moments in its development. To speak of the absolute idea may suggest the conception that we are at length reaching the right thing and the sum of the whole matter. It It is certainly possible to indulge in a vast amount of senseless declamation about the idea absolute, but its true content is only the whole system of which we have been hitherto studying the development. It may also be said in this strain that the absolute idea is the universal, but the universal not merely as an abstract form to which the particular content is a stranger, but as the absolute form into which all the categories, the whole fullness of the content it has given being to, have retired. The absolute idea may in this respect be compared to the old man who utters the same creed as the child, before whom it is pregnant and with the significance of a lifetime. Even if the child understands the truths of religion, he cannot but imagine them to be something outside of which lies the whole of life and the whole of the world. The same may be said to be the case with human life as a whole and the occurrences with which it is fraught. All work is directed only to the aim or end, and when it is attained, people are surprised to find nothing else but just the very thing which they had wished for. The interest lies in the whole movement. When a man traces up the steps of his life, the end may appear to him very restricted, but in it the whole decursus vitae is comprehended. So too the content of the absolute idea is the whole breadth of the ground which has passed under our view up to this point. Last of all comes the discovery that the whole evolution is what constitutes the content and the interest. It is indeed the prerogative of the philosopher to see that everything which, taken apart, is narrow and restricted, receives its value by its connection with the whole and by forming an organic element of the idea. Thus it is that we have had the content already, and what we have now is the knowledge that the content is the living development of the idea. The simple retrospect is contained in the form of the idea. Each of the stages hitherto reviewed is an image of the absolute, but at first in limited mode, and thus it is forced onward to the whole, the evolution of which is what we termed method. The several steps or stages of the speculative method are, first of all, A, the beginning, which is being or immediacy, self-subsistent for the simple reason that it is the beginning. But looked at from the speculative idea, being is the self-specializing act, which as the absolute negativity or movement of the notion makes a judgment and puts itself as its own negative. Being, which to the beginning as beginning seems mere abstract affirmation, is thus rather negation, dependency, derivation, and presupposition. But it is the notion of which being is the negation, and the notion is completely self-identical in its otherness, and is certainly of itself. Being therefore is the notion implicit, before it has been explicitly put as a notion. This being therefore, as its still unspecified notion, a notion that is only implicitly or immediately specified, is equally describable as the universal. When it means immediate being, the beginning is taken from sensation and perception, the initial stage in the analytical method of finite cognition. When it means universality, it is the beginning of the synthetic method. But since the logical idea is as much universal as it is in being, since it is presupposed by the notion as much as it is itself immediately is, its beginning is a synthetical as well as an analytical beginning. Philosophical method is analytical as well as synthetical, not indeed in the sense of a bare juxtaposition or mere altering employment of the two methods of finite cognition, but rather in such a way that it holds them merged in itself. In every one of its movements, therefore, it displays an attitude at once analytical and synthetical. Philosophical thought proceeds analytically insofar as it only accepts its object, the idea, while allowing its own way is only, as it were, an onlooker at its movement and development. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive. Philosophic thought, however, is equally synthetic, and evinces itself to be the action of the notion itself. To that end, however, there is required an effort to keep back the incessant impertinence of our own fancies and private opinions. B. The advance renders the explicit, the judgment, implicit in the idea. The immediate universal, as the notion implicit, is the dialectical force which on its own part deposes its immediacy and universality to the level of a mere stage or moment. Thus is put the negative of the beginning, its specific character. It supposes a correlative, a relation of different terms, the stage of reflection. Seeing the immanent dialectic only states explicitly what was involved in the immediate notion, this advance is analytical. But seeing that this notion, this distinction is not yet stated, is equally synthetical. In the advance of the idea, the beginning exhibits itself as what it is implicitly, is seen to be mediated and derivative, and neither to have proper being nor improper immediacy. It is only for the consciousness which is itself immediate, that nature forms the commencement or immediacy, and that spirit appears as what it is mediated by nature. The truth is that nature is the creation of spirit, and it is spirit itself which gives its presupposition in nature. The abstract form of the advance is, in being, an other, and transition into other. In essence, showing a reflection in the opposite. In notion, the distinction of the individual from the universality, which constitutes itself as such into, and is an identity with, what is distinguished from it. In the second sphere, the primarily implicit notion has come as far as shining, and thus is already the idea in germ. The development of this sphere becomes a regress into the first, just as the development of the first is a transition into the second. It is only by means of this double movement that the difference first gets its due, when each of the two members, distinguished, observed on its own part, completes itself to the totality, and in this way works out its unity with the other. It is only by both merging their one-sidedness on their own part that their unity is kept from becoming one-sided. The second sphere develops the relation of the differences to what it primarily is, to the contradiction in its own nature. A contradiction which is seen in the infinite progress is resolved, C, into the end or terminus, which the difference is explicitly stated as what is in the notion. The end is the negative of the first, and as the identity with that is the negativity of itself. It is consequently the unity in which both of these firsts, the immediate and the real first, are made constituent stages in thought, merged and at the same time preserved in the unity. The notion which from its implicitness thus comes by means of its differentiation, as the merging of that differentiation to close with itself, is the realised notion, the notion which contains the relativity or dependence of its special features in its own independence. It is the idea which, as absolutely first in the method, regards this terminus as merely the disappearance or the show or semblance, which made the beginning appear immediate, and made itself seem a result. It is the knowledge that the idea is the one systematic whole. It thus appears that the method is not extraneous form, but the soul and notion of the content, from which it is only distinguished so far as the dynamic elements of the notion, even on their own part, come to their own specific character to appear as the totality of the notion. The specific character of the content leads itself with the form back to the idea, and thus the idea is presented as a systematic totality, which is only one idea, of which several elements are each implicitly the idea, whilst they equally by the dialectic of the notion produce the simple independence of the idea. The science in this manner concludes by apprehending the notion of itself, as of the pure idea for which the idea is. The idea, which is independent or for itself, when viewed on the point of this its unity with itself, is perception or intuition, and the percipient idea is nature. But as intuition the idea is, through an external reflection, invested with the one-sided characteristic of immediacy or of negation. Enjoying, however, an absolute liberty, the idea does not merely pass over into life, or as finite cognition allow life to show in it. In its own absolute truth it resolves to let the moment of its particularity, or of the first characterization and other being, the immediate idea as its reflected image, go forth freely as nature. We now return to the notion of the idea with which we began. This return to the beginning is also an advance. We began with being, abstract being, where we now have also the idea as being, but this idea which has being is nature. End of Part 4 of Chapter 9, and end of The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, translated by William Wallace. Recording by Ryan Smallwood.